Okay, so I am talking about how art works, and I changed my subtitle to Can Psychology Talk to Philosophy? I am a psychologist that used to be an artist, and all my work focuses on the psychology of the arts, which has always been, well, is kind of a marginal area of psychology, but it is growing in force as we speak. So for centuries, aesthetics was a branch of philosophy, as you probably all know. But at the end of the 19th century, experimental psychologists began an empirical endeavor that they called aesthetics from below. So while philosophers like Kant speculated about the nature of the beautiful, experimental psychologists like Gustav Fechner and Wilhelm Wundt decided to find out what ordinary people think is beautiful. And their methodology was to give people pairs of stripped down stimuli, like single colors, light blue versus dark blue, or single tones, high versus medium, and ask people which they preferred. And they came out with a mountain of data of aesthetic preferences, very robust findings about very tiny atheoretical questions. Now, today, the psychology of art doesn't ask those kinds of questions. The most interesting questions that psychology of art asks are about philosophical questions about the arts to which we apply social scientific methods. And here are a few of them. I'm going to list a few, and then the final one is in red, and that's the one I'm going to focus on. What is art and what is not? How can non-sentient art objects express human emotions? Do we feel real emotions from art? Why are we drawn to art that evokes pain and sadness when we avoid those in our real life? Are aesthetic judgments objective or subjective, like matters of preferring vanilla ice cream over chocolate ice cream? Does fiction make us more empathic? And this is the one I'm going to focus on. How do we evaluate a work of art? Do we evaluate it by the product alone, or by our beliefs about the process and the mind that made it? And we approach these questions not as philosophers, but as social scientists, with hypotheses and experiments and manipulations of variables and statistics. So the question is, do we evaluate a work of art by the end product or by the process? And I'm going to try to approach this question from two entry points. First, I'm going to unpack the reasons why people dislike forgery by focusing on one kind of forgery, a perfect duplicate, a perfect fake. And this involves a series of experimental manipulations, which I'll tell you about. And I try to show, or I will try to convince you, that even when we rule out very obvious reasons why we dislike forgery, like the fact that they're fraudulent and therefore immoral, the fact that they don't bring any money on the art market, we still devalue them, and I'm going to suggest why. And the second entry point is about abstract art and how we judge skill in abstract art. And abstract art is, as you, I'm sure, know, often devalued because people look at it and they say, my kid could have done that. And I'm going to show that, contrary to what many people think, we can distinguish works by famous abstract expressionists that are superficially highly similar to work by children and animals, and I'm going to suggest why, and both will converge to answer the question that's up here. So first, forgery. The puzzle about forgery is, does the belief that a work is a forgery change your experience of the work? And if so, why? Now, philosophers have taken different approaches about this. There are anti-intentionalists in philosophy who say, we shouldn't pay any attention to the artist's intention when we're judging a work of art. We should only attend to the external image. We're talking about visual art. And the implication for our reaction to forgery is there's really nothing wrong with a perfect fake. There's no aesthetic difference between two identical images. And the only reason why we don't like a perfect fake is snobbery. Then there are people who take a very different position. I call them the intentionalists. They say, when you look at a work of art, we should try to understand the kind of achievement that a work of art represents by thinking about the artist's mind, the process, the decisions the artist made, the artist's intentions. And we should also take historical context into account, because there's something very different about a painting with linear perspective done in 1300, when perspective was just beginning to be developed, versus a painting done in perfect linear perspective at 1800, after it was already known and nobody had to discover it. You just had to learn a few lessons taught to you by somebody else. The implications for forgery is that forgery is a very different achievement from, there's a mistake up there, forgery is a very different achievement from an original. Sorry about that, I just caught that. And if we're judging a work of art by the kind of achievement it is, then forgery is a very different kind of achievement and should be judged differently. And also, a perfect fake lacks what Walter Benjamin called the aura of the original, its unique existence in historical time and space. And so we need to take historical context into account as well. So, many of you may know this story. This is a painting called Christ and the Disciples at Emmaus. Could you raise your hand if you know this story? Okay, very few. Good. So, a famous Vermeer specialist in 1937 named Bradius said, "We have here the masterpiece of Johannes Vermeer of Delft." However, it was discovered to be a forgery by Han van Meegeren, a Dutch 20th century painter, and he forged many Vermeers. He didn't copy Vermeers, he created new Vermeers. And he sold them and made a lot of money. And he also sold one to Hermann Goering during the war. And after the war, it was discovered that he had sold this to Goering, and he was arrested for being a traitor, for having sold Dutch treasures to the enemy. And he said, well, actually, it's not a Vermeer. I painted it. And of course, they didn't believe him, so they had him paint a new Vermeer, and there he is in jail, painting a new Vermeer. So, as soon as this painting was outed as a forgery, people's experience of that painting changed. Here are some sample dismissals. Sentimental, mediocre, and also that the face of the woman behind Christ looks like Greta Garbo. Now, here are some psychology experiments showing that if you take one group of people, like this group here, and you show them a set of images and you say these are originals, and you tell this group over here these are forgeries, and you ask people to rate them, and you compare the ratings, you find that this group here would have higher ratings on a host of dimensions than this group here, even though they are the same images. Things that are labeled as forgeries or copies, it doesn't matter which, are labeled as less good, less beautiful, less awe-inspiring, less interesting, more boring, even physically smaller. And also the activated brain areas change. When you're looking at something that you believe is an original, the reward areas of the brain get activated. So the question is why? It could be that the word copy or the word fake or the word forgery is just something that sounds negative. And so you misattribute the negative valence of this term to your experience of looking at the picture, and it kind of seeps over to your aesthetic evaluation of the picture. And so it's just because forgeries are bad things. Also, they're fraudulent. That's another reason. You could just think, well, forgeries are immoral, therefore that's a bad picture. Or it could be that the forgery isn't worth very much money, so that's negative, and so that seeps over into your aesthetic response. And these, in my mind, are obvious and kind of uninteresting reasons. So what we tried to do is rule out these obvious reasons to search for less obvious reasons. And the way we did this was to compare a copy by the artist, something that was labeled a copy by the artist, versus a copy by the artist's assistant. And we made clear that it was common practice in art to have assistants help you with the work and still have it be signed by the artist. And we indicated that the copy by the artist and the copy by the assistant were worth the same amount on the art market. So both are non-originals, neither are fraudulent, and both are worth the same amount of money because they're both signed by the artist. So here's what we did. We showed people two identical images, and we said the one on the left is the first in a series of 10 identical images. The one on the right is the second in a series of 10 identical images. The one on the left is by the artist, and the one on the right, depending on the condition you were in, so I would have to divide you up into 3 different groups. The one on the right is by the artist, so the artist copied himself, or the one on the right is by the artist's sanctioned assistant, commonplace in the arts, worth the same on the art market, signed by the artist, or the one on the right is by a forger, and when it was discovered to be a forgery, it was worth only $200 as opposed to the $53,000 that the others were worth. And then we asked a series of questions. And I've listed them here. Which one is more creative? Which do you like more original, more beautiful? Which is the better work of art? And which is more likely to be influential? After we got the ratings for these, we found that our questions clumped into 2 groups. Like, beautiful, and better had very similar ratings, and original, influential, and creative had similar ratings. And so what we did is we averaged those so that we had 2 scores. And we called the first the aesthetic evaluative, and we called the second the historical evaluative, because the second ones really have to do with pinpointing where the work was made, when the work was made in historical time. Our key comparison was how much is the artist's copy devalued relative to the original versus how much is the assistant's copy devalued relative to the original. And what we found is that on the aesthetic evaluative dimension of like, beauty, and better, no difference between the assistant copy and the artist copy. They were both devalued a little bit compared to the original, but there was no difference between these 2 kinds of copies. Of course, the forgery was always devalued the most, but we weren't really interested in that because forgery can be devalued because it's fraudulent or because it's worth nothing. And we were trying to get beyond those obvious reasons. So the assistant copy and the artist copy, identical in aesthetics, in how much people liked it, how beautiful it was, and which is the better work of art. And this is a point for the anti-intentionalists, because on the aesthetic evaluative dimension, looking good appears to be enough. On the historical evaluative dimension, how original, how influential, and how creative, what we found is the assistant's copy was significantly devalued relative to the original, more than the artist's copy relative to the original. The assistant copy was considered less original, less influential, and less creative than the artist's copy. And this is a point for the intentionalists. So, on the historical evaluative dimension, looking good is not enough. But note that both the assistant and the artist copy are copies. They're both signed by the artist, and they're both worth the same on the art market. So, in a sense, this is irrational. The question is why we do this, why we debase the assistant's copy more than the artist's copy, and what does this tell us about why we disparage a perfect fake? And I would like to argue that this is because of the belief in unobservable, invisible properties in works of art. And I call them mind and essence. Mind, okay, we appreciate a work of art, I believe, by projecting ourselves into the mind of the imagined artist. I have a debt to Theodor Lipps, philosopher here, who talked about Einfühlung, empathy. He argued that we appreciate a work of art by projecting ourselves into the work of art. And I'm expanding that a little to say we appreciate a work of art by projecting ourselves into the mind of the artist that made it. And so an artwork is really seen by us as a physical extension of the artist. So when we engage with a Picasso, we really feel like we're communing with Picasso's mind. And there was an article in the New York Times a few months ago where a dealer was handling a Mondrian, and he said, "I felt like I was shaking hands with the artist." This, to me, exemplifies how, when we look at a work of art, we're thinking about the mind that made it. And this also goes along with the psychological concept of essentialism, the belief that certain individual objects, like natural kinds, have an underlying reality or true nature that one cannot observe directly. It's kind of like what Walter Benjamin said about the aura of the original. And an example of this that everybody can understand is if you lose your wedding ring and you replace it with an absolutely identical ring, it is just not the same. It doesn't have the aura of the original one, but of course that's irrational because it's identical. There are other findings from other labs that support essentialist beliefs about art. And here's a nice finding from George Newman's study, where he showed people the picture on top. I know these are not very pleasing works of art, and I might have picked different ones, but those are the ones he picked. They kind of look like Kincaids. The target one, he said, this one has the property Goudir, which is a made-up word, and it's made by artist X. And then he showed people these two other paintings, and he said, this one is by artist X, and this one is by artist Y, but you'll notice that artist X, the one on the top and the one on the right, are very similar in subject matter. But the one on the left is made by the same artist as the target painting. And he asked one, which is more likely to have Goudir? And people said, the one on the left. So that's just a little bit of evidence for invisible essences of works of art that are imbued by the artist that made it. Now, I think that this essentialism in art, why does it say I only have 3 minutes left? Have I talked for that long? Seriously? Okay. Does essentialism predict our response to some new things that are happening? We have perfect three-dimensional prints of works of art. This is from the Van Gogh Museum, and this is the three-dimensional print, and this is the process by how it was made. Would you go to a museum to look at the 3D prints if you had a choice between looking at the original and the 3D? Maybe you'd go to look at the 3D prints if you couldn't see the originals, but would you go if you had a choice? Does essentialism predict our response to AI art? So the one on the left is an artificial intelligence painting produced by a computer who was fed 15,000 portraits, I think from the 15th century on to the 20th century, and it learned about portraits, and it spit this out, and it just sold at Christie's for over $400,000. People knew that it was a computer made. The one on the right is a new Rembrandt. This computer was fed many paintings by Rembrandt, and it figured out Rembrandt's style, and it spit out a new Rembrandt. We've just finished a study on responses to computer literature, where we read people famous passages from literature that they wouldn't recognize, and we told some people that it was created by an artificial intelligence system who learned how to write fiction from being fed many examples of fiction. And what we found is that our participants split in half. Some people thought that was just great, and they would like to read computer fiction. The other half thought it was terrible, and the ones who disliked it also had essentialist beliefs about art. We gave them a questionnaire that asked them to say how much they agreed with statements like, when I look at a work of art, I think about the artist's soul. I think about the artist's mind. I think about the artist's heart. And those people do not like AI art. We have essentialism in nature, too. You can order this tree, probably on Amazon, and assemble it and put it in your backyard, and it looks identical to a real tree, they say. It probably doesn't smell like a real tree, but it looks identical, and most people would not like to have this in their backyard because it doesn't have the essence of a tree. So what I've argued about forgery is that we evaluate originality, creativity, and influence in a work of art by inferring the mind of the artist and an essence of the work imbued by the artist. These are invisible properties. We don't have to know what that essence is to believe it, to believe that it's there. So forgery lacks the mind and the essence of the artist. And that's why, I believe, a perfect fake is devalued over and above more obvious reasons like fraud and monetary value. Now, let me turn to my second entry point, which is abstract art. And the puzzle is, do we distinguish art by great abstract expressionists from art by children and animals? I'm going to say we do, and if so, why? An art teacher named Robert Florjak gave this to his students, and he said, please analyze this Jackson Pollock and explain why it is good. And the students came up with all kinds of reasons about why this was great, including things like it's balanced in its randomness. Then he showed them this, which is his studio apron, and got them to see that what he had shown them was a close-up of his studio apron. So he therefore argues he hates modern art. In fact, the title of this YouTube video is Why is Modern Art So Bad? And he argues that works by Jackson Pollock, I don't think that really looks like a Pollock, but argues that works by Jackson Pollock would be indistinguishable from the daubs on his studio apron. And it is true that evaluating abstract art is difficult. This is somebody looking at a Cy Twombly painting. How do we evaluate that when we can't use realism as our metric? And that's why people look at these things and say, my kid could have done that. And I've heard extremely educated people say that. It's not surprising, therefore, that the work of children has sometimes been sneaked into art museum. This is a 5-year-old child. His mother was an art critic, and she posted his works online at the online Saatchi Gallery, and art critics responded to what great new voice had just appeared on the art scene. And this is a painting by Congo, Chimp, in London, and his paintings, one on the right is by Congo, were sneaked into a museum and fooled people. And this is elephant art. So now, the question is, can we tell the difference between works by children and animals on the one hand and abstract art by famous abstract expressionists? I'll just give you some pairs of paintings, and I'll just ask you for the first pair to raise your hand. If you think the one on the left is by the artist, raise your hand. If you think the one on the right is by the artist, raise your hand. Okay, good. 2/3 of you about got it right. And that's the 2/3 rule we find over and over again. This was by Elaine de Kooning, and this is by an elephant. It doesn't matter whether you like the one by the elephant better. It matters which you think was by the master. Okay. Child, Sam Francis, famous artist. Child, Morris Louis. Elephant, Franz Klein. Now, art historians have had very different reactions to abstract art. So the great art historian Ernst Gombrich disparaged abstract art. He thought that representational art was a great achievement of humans, and he thought abstract art was just an expression of the artist's emotions and personality. Kirk Varnado, who was the curator at the Museum of Modern Art, wrote this book called Pictures of Nothing about abstract art, and he defends abstract art, and I'll just read you a quote. The mind-boggling range of drips, stains, blobs, blocks, bricks, and blank canvases seen in museums of modern art are not random. Like all works of art, they are vessels of human intention, and they generate meaning ahead of naming. They represent a series of deliberate choices by the artist. They involve invention, and they evoke meanings, for example, energy, space, depth, repetition, serenity, and discord. Okay, so we gave these pairs in our first study to people and asked them which one is better. The first 10 pairs were unlabeled. The next 20 pairs were labeled, but half of the labels were correct and half were reversed. And here's what we found. 79% correct with the correct labels. Kind of obvious if you have the correct labels. No labels, 65% correct. Remember the 2/3 rule? And reverse labels, this is what fascinated us. Even when we gave them the wrong labels, they were still 2/3 correct. And these were all significantly above chance. Come on, okay. We did a whole bunch of conceptual replications. We presented these just one by one rather than in pairs. Instead of asking which is better, we asked which one is by the artist. We gave them to children. We looked at how long people looked, and we at the ones by children versus the ones by artists. We even gave it to a machine because an AI expert called me up and asked if he could teach his machine how to do this, and the machine also could make these discriminations and also made the exact same errors as humans. And the machine and the humans were about 2/3 correct. So what I've argued about abstract art is that we see the mind in the art. We ignore the false labels, and the mind leaps out. We see the greater intentionality. I left out something important. We actually asked people to rate the paintings on how intentional they looked. The more intentional they looked, the more likely they were to be classified as by an artist. So we see the mind in the art, we see the intentionality in the art, and we're not fooled by the labels. We go beneath the labels to go for the one where we see the mind. And so we see a lot more in abstract art than we think we do. So I think that the intentional philosophers are right. A perfect fake lacks the artist's process, the artist's intention, the artist's mind, and a painting by a child or an animal lacks intentionality. And we can see this despite the fact that there's either no label or a wrong label. And these are invisible properties, or at least we can't pinpoint what they are. So this is my last slide. I hope that philosophers and psychologists can work together on these problems. The point of doing this kind of research is not to say gotcha to the philosophers, we've proved you wrong, but to take the really interesting questions that philosophers have asked and figure out whether we can, especially if the philosophers' questions are inherently psychological, like how do we judge a work of art, and do some research on it to get some empirical answers. And I'd just like to close by thanking my lab, the Arts and Mind Lab, and my final slide, I'm sorry I lied. For extra credit, this is a painting that hangs in Annie Westcott's office. We started out this morning with talking about Barry Blumberg. This is a painting done by Jean Blumberg, and most people would see the mind in the work and the intentionality in the work and not confuse it with an elephant, a chimp, or a child. Thank you.
I see a question over here.
Erwin Shapiro, Cambridge, Massachusetts. It was very interesting. I was wondering if you could elaborate a little on the choice of the people who made all these judgments.
Yes.
And how reliable they were.
Who were our participants? Okay. In our first study, we used the usual things, psychology undergraduates. We also used art majors. We compared them, and they behaved very similarly. In the later studies, except for the one with children, we used something called Mechanical Turk, which is basically a survey instrument, and people will take your survey if you pay them. And we get some demographic information. We get their age, we get their amount of education, and we get their familiarity with art. And we excluded people who said they had any familiarity with art, or a lot of familiarity with art, particularly abstract art. So these are people who at least say they don't know much about art. Those are our people. We have not given these tests to art experts.
Frank Stewart is next.
Frank Stewart, New York. It really follows from the previous question. I suspect that our attitudes to copies and versus originals are largely culturally conditioned. If I'm not mistaken, Chinese art traditionally didn't make much distinction between an original painting or a work of calligraphy and a copy thereof. And I think the same is true also in the case of architecture, which was buildings often made of wood and were renewed many times, like Washington's Acts, and nobody was bothered by this.
This is a very Western view. You're absolutely right. These are all studies with Western subjects, and it could be very different in other cultures. And I agree with you completely about China. There's also some quote-unquote primitive cultures who don't care who made the work, and so there's no concept of originality. So we have developed this probably maybe in the Renaissance. This concept of the great genius artist and originality emerged and has dominated our thinking about art.
Yes.
Hi, Hi, Emily Thompson, New York. When you were doing the study of the paintings done by children and animals, was there a way to adjust for the fact that the colors, the tools, the media was being chosen by human adults?
We did choose them by human adults. Actually, my graduate student at the time, Angelina Hawley Dolan, who was also an artist, chose them, and she put them together to make them as similar as possible. And but I did say that we also did these studies showing them one at a time, so you didn't have the benefit of the contrast. They were all chosen by humans, and they were all chosen by her, and they were chosen because they were, the ones by artists were chosen because they were featured in major museums, and they were by abstract expressionists. This would not work with any style of art besides abstract expressionism. It wouldn't work with minimalist art, so it's not all abstract art that it would work with. But yes, humans chose these.
Yes.
Aside from the background of the people in the experiments,
Yes.
aside from the background of the people in the experiments, were there individuals who were consistently good at identifying which was by the artist and which not?
That's a good question, and actually, I'm sorry to say that I don't know. We didn't look at that. I'm sure that if I gave this to art historians, they would be very good. I actually presented this work to the art history department at Boston College, where I teach, and I was really surprised by their reaction. They were enraged. They said, how could you possibly put these two things together, great art and this work by animals and children? And I said, but my whole point is to show that we can see the difference. And they said, well, the question itself was offensive, so.
I think Philip Gingrich was. Yeah.
Philip Gingrich, Ann Arbor. Children grow up to be adults, and I'm curious when they become intentional.
You know, I also study children's art from a very young age, and children are intentional at a very young age. They will draw things that don't look like anything to you, and they will say it's an airplane. And at first they label it after the fact, so maybe that's pre-intentional and they're discovering an intention. But really by the age of late 2, 3, they will say, I'm going to draw an airplane. And then they might make it kind of what's called an action scribble. So it moves like an airplane. It doesn't look like an airplane. So very young.
I think there's a question.
Yeah. Mark Thompson, New York. In a case where a third of people call it wrong, between animal and artist. What do you think is going on there? Is this likely to be, do you think, a false reading of mind in essence, or is in this instance those people not making that kind of evaluation at all?
So I want to answer that question by showing you my extra slide. The works that were, what's the matter? Oh, the light down? Can we turn the light down a little, Jeremy? Okay. Some of these were very difficult to do. So I have, am I doing something wrong with this?
We're trying to land to 747 in the middle of this. We're figuring out the order of questions because our.
Oh, okay. Okay. So the one on the top is by Joan Mitchell, and this is one that people consistently got wrong, but they also gave it low intentionality ratings. And the one on the bottom is by a child, and people also consistently got that wrong, and they gave that one high intentionality ratings. So when people are getting it wrong, they're perceiving intentionality in the child, and they're thinking it's by an artist. Or they're perceiving no intentionality in the works by the artist, or low, and they're thinking it's by a child or an animal. So I think that's what's going on. So I'm not claiming 100%. I'm claiming intentionality is what drives it.
Did we have, here and then upstairs? Yeah.
Jerry Rubenstein, Gladwin, Pennsylvania. I am seriously red-green colorblind, as some major portion of the male population of the world, 1/3, I'm told. How do you correct for that? Particularly in abstract art, I have no problem enjoying Rembrandt. I do have a lot of problem enjoying abstract art, which relies heavily on color. And in fact, the authenticity of two that you showed, one was black and white, and that led me to easily determine that it was an original. The colors in the other they don't work for me. So I wonder if you injected that possibility, since it's not it's a substantial minority.
Did you say 1/3?
That's what I'm told.
Because my husband's colorblind.
A red-green colorblind to some degree.
To some degree, okay. We did not ask, are you colorblind? That's a really important question that you just asked, and I hadn't thought about that, even though I'm married to somebody who's colorblind. I thought it was rarer than that. My guess, though, is that the ones that are gotten wrong are not gotten wrong because those people happen to be colorblind, since the majority of people got those wrong. And I think it's because of intentionality. But if we do this study again, a perceived intentionality, we should definitely rule out anybody like you or Howard who's colorblind.
Just, yes, one here and then there.
Margaret Levy, Stanford. I'm wondering if you've done any of these experiments with outsider art where there's incredible intentionality, but there is questions about the maker and the ways in which they've learned the art and where the source of the intentionality.
Yeah, well, I think those are very intentional works of art, outsider art. They're just not by prestigious people, and they may not look as skilled as they're usually representational, and they probably look a little bit, maybe they're not all, but in any case, no, we haven't studied outsider art. I do think that you can manipulate people's responses to work by the labels, even though here I showed people go beyond the labels. But if you show people a work of art that's representational, and you say it's by a student versus a famous artist, or it's by an unknown versus somebody famous, you can probably show how malleable our aesthetic judgments are. But we haven't looked at outsider art, which I actually am very interested in, as well as the art of the mentally ill, which is another form of outsider art. People might actually like it just because it's so unusual. Just like they might like elephant art just because it's elephant art. And remember, we asked which they thought was a better work of art, not which they like more.
Last question from the balcony.
Hi, Irvin Weathersby from New York. My question really stems from the computer-generated works of art. I wonder if you could speak to why those are generating so much interest, if they are obvious forgeries or frauds.
Well, they're not actually frauds because they're saying they're computer-generated. They're not trying to fool anybody. So I think that they're generating a huge amount of interest because, first of all, people can't believe that computers can actually produce a Rembrandt. This is shocking and amazing. And it's kind of a conversation piece. So to me, that's...
Rembrandt is terrible, as far as I could see.
But if I had...
They have the images of Rembrandt, but it had no sense of life.
I wish that I had tested you on that before I told you that it was made by a computer, and then we'd see if you were correct, because it's always easy after the fact.
Yeah.
Okay.
But you may be right.
Thank you.
Got more out of me than the...
And people wrote about that unfinished look. They said, how could this look so modern? Its unfinishedness made it look very modern. And remember, that's the one that went for $400,000. And it may be better to have AI art that's not creating new Rembrandts. If you create new Rembrandts, you're diluting people's understanding of art history. Because those things are going to get unlabeled as AI art, and people are going to start to believe they're Rembrandts. So I think it's a very bad idea.
I think that's where we are. Thank you so much. Thank you.